Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I'm Dave Nicolai. I'm not Dr. Devlin Strange. Devlin is our new weed scientist at the University of Minnesota in Extension. He had an extended trip over into India, as you can well imagine, with COVID and bureaucracy and so forth, and a number of other things and visas. So he'll be coming back, hopefully here this weekend into next week. But this is his presentation. I work as a regional extension educator, primarily in weed science and crops, and so that's my background in Minnesota, and also doing graduate work here at North Dakota State University. So we're going to talk a little bit primarily about water hemp here. Next door in your breakout sessions, Dr. Srangi's a graduate student, has a display of the various pigweed species. So it's an opportunity for you to see not just redwood pigweed, but water hemp, Ppo Amaranth. Also, we brought some Palmer Amaranth, and so you get an idea to see what those all look like at the vegetative stage, not only seedling, but also larger stages as well. So make sure in the breakouts that you have an opportunity to do that and sharpen your weed ID skills as well. I want to thank Joe for supplying some of those that weed, so we didn't have to import those all across the border and coming out of the greenhouses here in Fargo as well. Okay, let's see if this, I don't know if we're all the way on here. There we go, I guess we are, okay. I want to talk a little bit about the basics here of water hemp, just to cause a common ground here in terms of identification. Thinking back about that, even if you don't have this weed species, but you think you might have in terms of the actual weed itself in the field, but a couple of key characteristics that we look for in terms of weed ID. First of all, remember that it has a male and a female plant out in the field with that. And in addition to that, we have no hairs really on the stem or the leaves. The leaves themselves oftentimes appear more shiny, almost a waxy appearance. They're smooth, a little bit more long and narrow, so I call it more lanceolate in terms of shape. But again, the male and the female flowers are on different plants. The seed and the pollen heads are long and narrow, and they're typically located in more of a, sometimes even a panicle inflorescence near the tip of the branches. When you look at the Palmer over in the next door, you'll see an indication there, and we have some pictures of much longer inflorescence in terms of the male and the female flowers on the plant itself. But again, you're going to see a lot of differentiation in the field because phenotypically you have a male plant appearing different than a female plant, but it's all water hemp per se. So that's kind of some basic ID in terms of the weed itself. Okay. In terms of maybe there's a little bit of a delay. Okay. I don't know if we're going. Can you maybe advance it just in case? All right. What did I say next in terms of that? A little bit in terms of biology and when these weeds emerge in terms of timing. On the very bottom of the screen, it may be difficult to see in the back of the room, is water hemp. The time scale on the bottom of the frame is the dates of emergence. And you'll notice typically we're looking at emergence on water hemp from about the middle of May all the way through the early part of August. Now, you know what they say about rules in terms of that. Never say it can't be broken. Back in 2020 in North Dakota and in Minnesota, we discovered water hemp emerging very, very early, outside of this time frame, the first week in May. So in that situation, it depends upon the environment and so forth and how those things go together, but typically in that kind of a scenario where we're finding emergence, it may prove to go out and scout for these early emerging weeds in some years, even in early May. So it does happen, but typically we're looking at water hemp, and the more important thing here for you to notice is the extended emergence of water hemp. This is important from a control standpoint, all the way back into the early part of August. Now, redwood pigweed is similar. Usually cuts off, doesn't extend quite as far, maybe a little bit early. Common ragweed and giant ragweed, you see they're both indicated that they're typically a much earlier in terms of emergence. And so there's some things you can do with tillage, rotation, and delay in planting and so forth to get ahead of that. But they typically don't go on later in the season. And you compare that to, even kochia, quite a bit earlier with that. Okay, you want to try it again for me? All right, we're working? All right, thanks for the batteries. Okay, we'll give this a try. There we go. All right, in terms of the basics of weed control, I thought I'd get this out of the way because we asked questions about this later, and then then after this we'll talk about biology and herbicide resistance. I'm going to point out some pages that are in your weed control guide. They'll be your homework or take-home read as well. But if you look at the top line in terms of water hemp, we have a typical range of an auxin type mode of action that would be a group 4. So things like 2,4-D, dicamba, etc. They can range from poor to excellent. So you'll say, why is it poor in one situation and why is it excellent? A lot of it has to do with the timing in terms of the size of the weeds and so forth. And you can well imagine the earlier the better, the weather, the environment, drought, hardening off, etc. The next column over is the Ppo inhibitors. That would be the group 14. So products such as Flexstar, Cobra, Laser, etc. In more of a fair to excellent. Again, the size of the weed makes a difference in here in terms of control. But again, smaller the better, warmer conditions and so forth, a little bit more satisfactory control. Then the group 15, which has grown to be more than just the dual herbicides, but we talk about Zidua and Outlook, etc. Right here rated as a good for control. Water solubility will have some things to do with that in terms of the Outlook being maybe a little bit more water soluble, but in terms of moisture, but generally very good control by itself. And then the HPPD inhibitors, the group 27, things like Callisto, Lotus, and so forth, depending upon the crop, when it's allowed into good to excellent. But if we look at not just soybeans, but we think about other rotation crops such as corn and so forth, combinations. And what we find a lot of people are doing in terms of trends is basically looking at these with the idea of a mixture of active ingredients, not just post-emergence applied, but really in a soil applied application to look for synergy and enhanced development. The other weeds are listed on the bottom. Of course, our control is going to vary, but by and large, those trends hold true. In addition, online, Joe talked about the weed control bulletin. We've co-authored between Minnesota and North Dakota a herbicide-resistant trait publication. You can go online and look at this, but basically we're trying to look at what traits allow which herbicide products on them, basically to take care of some of the confusion of misidentifying things, obviously hurting or injuring or killing the crop by putting the wrong trait in there. So it goes through a great detailed discussion of the various traits that are out there, whether, say, for example, you're looking at an enlist trait, a liberty trait, whatever it might be in terms of the product use and the recommendation. But you can go to Ag Communications, there's hard copies available, but certainly you can go and search for that as well. I won't get into all those details today, but it's a good planning tool going forward when you're dealing with rotating traits, etc. A little bit of research going back here. Dr. Jeff Gonzalez, our previous extension weed scientist, and others had worked with tracking the growth rate of weeds, and this particularly is both giant ragweed and water hemp. We have a lot of giant ragweed that's in eastern Minnesota and does seem to be moving well into western Minnesota. So it's not necessarily just an eastern affair, and I would predict obviously it's going to keep moving west in those cases. In that situation, that would be the darker line. The red line here would be akin to water hemp in those situations. And typically, where we don't apply a pre and it's growing in the field, this is a usual growth pattern. You're going to go along here, say for example, from early May up to about the middle of June. And then usually year in and year out, by about the middle of June, we're going to have what we call the exponential growth rate of these weeds. And if we look at it, typically we think about it this way in terms of a rule of thumb, that in an 18-day period, and when it's highlighted on the right, these weeds grew an average of 20 to 30 inches. So a tremendous spurt of growth, if you want to put it that way, particularly when we get to the middle of June, for both weeds, in terms of track that. So we need to think about timing this in terms of applying a pre, staying ahead of this, but then more importantly, you can see you can well be beyond the label on certain post-emergence products if you delay things too long and with rapid weed growth that subsequently would come in. But keep in mind, the biology of how this growth occurs. It's not a steady incline per se, but there is a exponential growth, particularly given our climate and the sunlight and so forth when we talk about the day length about the middle of June. A little bit about adjusting your strategy here in terms of water hemp. We talk about this often on both sides of the Red River, and that is a layered approach in terms of water hemp emergence. And you can think about it on the bottom axis here from May and peaking into July and going into August. And then utilizing either a group 15 or a group 14 herbicide, depending upon a combination or how they're labeled, where you can actually not only apply them as a pre, but come back and make a second application so that you have enough of that chemistry of that herbicide effective through the month of July and into August. The bottom line here is having enough chemistry in the profile here so that you can take control of emergent weeds that come up late in the season with it. So in terms of a herbicide concentration here, we have this gray line, it's kind of fictitious, but the bottom line, we have that effective control. That pre, of course, being applied early in situations with that, and then coming back maybe 30 days after planting with another application of residual in terms of that application so that you have that extended herbicide for the activity because of the later emerging things with water hemp, and then of course pushing those out into the month of August in terms of that activity. Now this is important, in soybeans obviously we want to take advantage of the crop canopy in here to help us as well, but also think about other crops like corn and so forth. If that water hemp is present in there, we want to have enough product effectiveness because that water hemp can come up late in the season, doesn't get very tall, but can set seed along with that. So putting these pieces together, okay? Whether you have a giant ragweed, which we do have in parts of Minnesota, or water hemp, you can sometimes delay tillage, or use spring tillage, say for example, if it's just a giant ragweed concern. Again, we want that effective control of the herbicide. You can put the post on or later that residual, even longer in terms of that, so extending that control farther out in the season. Some of you might remember this tillage instrument called a cultivator, okay? If you can find that in the grove, if you haven't already sold it or still have that, it's still a valuable tool along with that in here. But then the crop canopy as well, in terms of what it can do in terms of weed control. And then this other concept of actually what I call taking care of hand weeding, which might be the edge of the field, patrolling the edges, whether it's neighbors, whether it's road ditch, drainage ditch, or whatever, so those weeds aren't moving into the field. So that's a concept as well as actually physically removing the weeds in terms of that. The goal here with all of this is to prevent seed production, because even if you have a small patch, and Joe and I talked about this yesterday at Moorhead, is you want to get on top of it, of these small patches. Don't let them get out of your control here in terms of that, because you want to prevent seed production and being more endemic with that. So might be a combination. Back in 2017, Dr. Gonzalez looked at a survey in terms of water hemp, primarily in southwestern and south central Minnesota. And we looked at 84 samples. They were sent to the University of Illinois in terms of sampling, and 52% of these water hemp plants were identified as being resistant to PPO herbicides. So that would be like, the group 14s when we talk about the cobras, the flex stars, and so forth. 82% were identified as having the glyphosate resistant because of gene amplification, and at least 8% were sensitive to both, okay? In terms of that. So these were preliminary ones done with survey help of crop consultants, etc. Devlin, this past year and the year before, with the help of Najat and other graduate students, it has looked in 2020, all of the red dots on there, 21 populations of water hemp in Minnesota were sampled, and we'll go over those results in terms of analysis of what we found for resistance. But in 2021, we did blue dots, and all the way up here in Red River Valley and back in south, so we hope to learn a lot more in terms of the status and what strategies might be in terms of that. Keep in mind, you've got a water hemp plant with a male and a female and the ability through another number of mechanisms to develop resistance in a very short order situation with that. So let's talk about what we did here for 2020. They took these back in the greenhouse and they screened them at 2 different levels, at a normal level of 1x and then 3 times the rate, okay, the 3x. So we've got these products, Raptor, Roundup, Atrazine, Liberty, Flexstar, Callisto, 2,4-D, choline, and dicamba, all right? In terms of what we set as a threshold, it was a 40% survival rate, and if we had, less than 40% surviving, or I should say more than 40% surviving, we had a resistance level in terms of that. So the 40% was a cutoff, and we used that at what we call the 3x rate, so 3 times the normal rate. So we had enough product out there in terms of the greenhouse. These are the preliminary results, and again, I might read these off a little bit for the back of the room. But the Raptor, product, or Amazamox here on the bottom, of the 21 populations, 100% of all the populations showed resistance at that 3x level. The glyphosate, 68% of the populations showed resistance. Again, that's pretty typical. It's not necessarily that we find it across the whole spectrum of the field, but there is a big majority that have the glyphosate resistance, but it's not always 100%. The interesting thing, atrazine was found at 14%. Now, we're not necessarily a big atrazine user state. However, in a lot of western Minnesota, a lot of growers now are using like a ½ pound of atrazine from a synergistic effect or synergy. There are differences in southeastern part of the state, but we have found 14% of the population. And then of the homosapen or the Ppo, we found 14% of that. And then for the first time, the HPPD or the group 27, this is mesotrione, you think of Callisto and those products, that came in at 5%. So there were some populations that actually showed resistance with that. We really don't have that trade out across the landscape. Certainly it's there. There was nothing to indicate anything about glufosinate or 2,4-D choline or dicamba here. Now there's been reports in other states in the United States, but not in this particular sampling size and population. But that indicates what we did with the 21. Again, we're going to be much more broad and extensive with that. If we talk about this population a little bit more, in terms of resistance, the ALS was at 8% populations of the 21. Down here on the bottom, EPSP, which would be the glyphosate, then the ALS and the photosystem 2, which would be the atrazine, and the group 27. There was one population that was 4-way. In other words, that population was resistant all the way through to all 4 of those, okay? And the same thing just above it, you slide off the HPPD, you put in the PPO. There was one population that had resistance all the way through in that particular area. So, we know in that situation that there are concerns and we need to think about rotation. There was 1 or 2 that were 3-way. There was 8 populations that were glyphosate and ALS. So still the vast majority of it, but some are multiple. So here's a distribution in Minnesota this last year. Again, this population, or should say in 2020, where the red dot indicates the 4-way and the 3-way, but a lot of them in southwestern and south central, but certainly we suspect it's farther along. A little bit here in terms of glyphosate and some of the research and conventional, when we look at glyphosate along with Enlist, these are some of the timings Dr. Sarangi did. He looked at early post, mid post, and a late post just prior here to R1 for timing. Again, a little bit more difficult from the back of the room, but the top half that's shaded is recommendations or treatments that were given in the field with Warrant, which is a pre-emergence herbicide. The bottom half, the 9 through 18, was without the pre. And then there were various treatments in here, some with Liberty, and then followed up by, in some cases, Liberty, and then with Enlist 1 by itself, or Enlist 1 in Durango, which is generic glyphosate, and then dual with or without, or maybe a late application, and then they were repeated basically down below without that. So let's talk about some of these results, but again, with and without in terms of the pre. And if we just look at the numbers, just taking those into account and summing those up, the red dot a little bit of a whisker or bar plant here, where we have no pre, and the water hemp density is on the left-hand side. The higher the number on the left-hand side, being up 200 means we have a much worse problem in terms of water hemp density. So the no pre, looking at the data, definitely showed an increase in there. And down below on the right-hand side, summed all the data up. One little blue dot by itself, and very low where we had the pre involved in here. So just looking through the data itself, separating those out, a significant difference. In terms of water hemp control, the bottom half, the shaded again area, is all with the pre's. Say for example, above it is non-pre's, and some variation, and we can talk about where those fall in. The one-time liberty down below with the pre, still very respective. The one-time liberty not as indicative of what you would like to have, particularly where there was no pre, and then of course right below that one-time liberty is a non-treated control. Well, picture's worth 1,000 words here in terms of timing here. Upper left-hand corner is what we call the check of the non-treated control. Just to the right of it are two applications of liberty, and we still see weeds present. On the bottom left-hand corner, warrant followed by liberty, later on followed by enlist. Say for example with the glyphosate, and the bottom right-hand water hemp again, followed by liberty, and enlist and Durango, followed with another application of dual for continued control, and much cleaner with that, so that the dual came back in there as effectively as a layered situation with that. And a little bit about tank mixing, and we put these all together. Here again, the right-hand side indicates treatments, basically 12 through 15 here, and that's all the enlist treatments here with Durango, Liberty, or Liberty and Durango, and even in applications. And we're looking at primarily what would happen when we tank mix those two. We still had respectable control, but certainly we didn't necessarily enhance it when we did that versus the Durango or Liberty by itself. On the left-hand side, in the non-treated, number 2 was just an application of XtendMax. Okay, and then the third is a Liberty application, some XtendMax and Liberty with that as well in different combinations, along with warrant, but giving them much better control. But I think the purpose of this research here primarily was to look at do we get any synergy here by tank mixing the Liberty and the glyphosate versus in and or alone. Certainly acceptable control, but not necessarily enhanced control with that. But it gives you an indication on the non-treated and the glyphosate as well. So this is some of the research that's going to be published a little bit more with that. So some of the take-home messages here is resistant weeds are here, obviously. They were always here, in that standpoint, and they will continue to be here in terms of that. What you do does matter here, obviously. So I would still recommend multiple effective sites of actions, not just one, whether it's a pre or whether it's a post. Your goal is a 0 weed threshold here throughout. With that, remember, soybeans that are growing well are going to help you to outcompete these weeds. Use this weed biology in terms of that. that water hemp is going to be continued growth through the summer. You want to break that cycle of going back to the same product again and again in terms of the strategy. I got a couple minutes left here. All right. Want to talk a little bit about Palmer Amaranth in terms of an update. On the other side of the river in Minnesota, the legal status is it's a prohibited noxious weed since 2014. So the way the law reads, all above ground parts of the plant have to be destroyed. There's no transportation or propagation with that. And then since 2016, they added this. It's called a prohibited weed seed. So no seed is allowed and anything else offered for seed sale in the state, which means anything from ag, vegetables, to flowers, trees, shrubs, you name it, in terms of sold within Minnesota. Now, since 2016, this is from the Minnesota Department of Ag, there has been 98 suspected sites in 22 counties that have been identified in terms of that. So some are still being surveyed, but it gives you an idea about the breadth and width about this. In terms of situations, we look at where this came from, feed and forage sources, all right? So whether it's hay, cottonseed brought in from the south, sunflower screenings, other types of screenings, contaminated CRP, cover crop seed, and even contaminated equipment brought in from out of state, as well as possibilities in terms of key introduction modes. So you got to know your sources or potential sources with that. So we're going to stop here. I'm going to take a little question. On the very left-hand side is a AA battery. In a AA battery, I don't know, did we put AA's in here? AAA's, okay, well, close. AA batteries. On the right-hand side is a ruler, but in the middle is a vial, okay, so you get the size here. So here's my question. How many amaranth seeds are in that middle container? Anybody have a guess? You still get lunch either way, so don't worry about it. Anybody have a guess? Shout out a number.
500,000.
500,000.
3,000.
3,000, okay? All right. That's like, you know, Montana, you can drive any speed on the freeway you want. So you've got a big range here, right? And is there a third guess? Somewhere in between. 100,000, not too bad, okay, all right. All right, so not very big in terms of that. There's 43,560 seeds, approximately, in that container. Why is that significant? What does that remind you of? How many what? How many square feet in an acre? So you've got one seed for every square foot in that acre of land in that. Okay, so think about cleaning out machinery or combine. Or I bought something online auction from, I don't know, Iowa, whatever, they drove it up here. It came from Nebraska, all right? You know, what's in Nebraska? A lot of Palmer amaranth, okay? So in any case, so it doesn't take much in terms of that, in terms of contamination, one way, shape, or form in terms of that, all right? So when the Minnesota Department of Ag finds a site, what do they do about it? They flame it off, okay? And, or they use the product on the bottom, Milestone, at 7 ounces per acre to eradicate it, and they monitor this for or up to 3 years in terms of that, to make sure that they don't have, you know, weeds coming back in those situations. So typically between that and hand pulling, but it is monitored on that particular site. This is a map, a little bit of the state. It's a little hard to see from the back, but on the right-hand side, just south of the Twin Cities, in that green where that arrow, that box is, that's Goodhue County. Now, Goodhue County is right along the Minnesota River, and in that particular area, they have a lot of rolling, they have a lot of hay ground, but we had 2 finds last year. Both were in cornfields, and we still haven't identified how it got there, okay? Wasn't in hay fields, these were in cornfields. On the left-hand side, we have the counties close to Clay County and Polk County. The seed was identified in chicken scratchings, in feed, okay? Didn't end up in the field, but it was analyzed and so forth with that. So there's potential for that. It certainly has happened before. We've had screenings fed to cattle down in Redwood County, down by Farm Fest, went through the cattle, ended up out in the soybean field, and the Palmer amaranth grew out in the field itself. So, seed over there, unknown over there. I mean, there's been past situations too in the state as well. Next door, you're going to find the Palmer, the bottom left-hand corner. The petiole is longer than the leaf blade. That's really the big indication here. It's the only thing I like that pigweed doesn't do that. So keep that in mind. The top one is the sharp stipules that you'll find in the female plants. But keep in mind along that. You're going to have the long amaranth, but if you're looking vegetatively, if you bend it over, that petiole part longer than the blade itself. We have other things, redwood pigweed, water hemp in the bottom right-hand corner, Powell amaranth, which is found in the western areas, this area as well. It's much like redwood pigweed, some subtle difference that he can go over with you, but certainly that's as well with that. So if you find it on that side, of course, record it, take a picture of it, don't throw it in the road ditch and forget it. Put it in the bag, store it until it's actually identified, contact the Department of Ag inspectors, arrest the pest, but immediately call in terms of that help. So those are the things I wanted to get through, stay on time, because I'm between you and lunch and breakout. So is there time for a question or two?
Have you guys been doing any research on like the Harrison seed destructor? I know we're looking at layering techniques and want zero water hemp and palmer, but that's not always going to be the case with any herbicide program.
Right, right. We haven't had applied research in Minnesota, in Iowa. That guy sitting next to you over there has been involved in there, Seth Nave. We talked about weed seed and situations, but I don't know if in Seth in Wisconsin have they been doing any work. It's just been in Iowa for right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, that one's gearing up for it.
He's gearing up for it, okay. But you know, there's potential with it. We're also looking at diverting that behind the combine instead of spreading it all over. You know, if you can narrow it down into a single row in situations with that. Early research takes horsepower, but it does seem to work in terms of that because it just hammers the crap out of everything with that in the horsepower. So there's potential on it in those situations. Not yet, but stay tuned. Anything else? Otherwise, yeah, one more.
Does burning actually kill the germination of the seed?
Will you repeat that?
Oh, okay, the question was, does burning, you're talking about Palmer? You know, obviously, if we're talking about the plants before the seed is physiologically mature, you know, if you can get ahead of that, you know, yeah, obviously there might be situations with that. If the seed is mature and so forth, I think it depends upon the temperature of incineration. You might be able to do that, but I think a lot of that depends upon the timing. I think some of their early things in their burning was primarily to get rid of the material before it set the seed physiologically, but it goes through the same thing as any crop seed. You get, you know, green and get to the point where it's physiologically mature. I don't know if Eichley's in the room here, but I don't know if there's anything on this side in terms of that, but I think that's primarily what you want to be able to do. Hence, but they're also relying on the milestone too. Yeah, and here in herbicide.